So, what should we discuss today?
You have to promise to be.
Why do we think that it is scripture? Why do we think
The Catholic Church is established by God, Jesus, who is God, to teach us the truth, to know what is authentic and what is not. So it decides, it shines a spotlight on all the texts which claim to be biblical. And by the power of God, it identifies those which are authentic. As simple as that. So you could have the most well accepted, universally accepted text, say like St. Paul's letters to the Romans, first letters to the Corinthians. They still might not be by him. None of the Gospels might be by people who wrote in the first century. Only with the Catholic Church can you know for sure, because it's established by Christ.
Could it be written by somebody else, but still be legitimate, still be worth?
That's where we were before you came here. The Catholic Church says that these texts are inspired by the Holy Spirit. As that is so, they are authentic. It doesn't matter who the author is, really. It matters whether, because how can the authorship matter compared to God himself being the author? If the Church establishes that God is the author, that's all that matters. Now,
you kind of see his issue. I mean, in the sense that you can't prove, you can't demonstrate its authenticity without going to the fact that you're a Christian.
No, you can't. You can't. With any ancient text, you can't. But then he's not neutral. He's a Muslim, and they're trying to tell us that the Quran is authentic, and that they have a tradition called Hadith, which are authentic, and these start appearing 200 years after Muhammad left the earth. So if he, from a Muslim position, is trying to tell us documents like that are authentic, then he's in difficulty. An atheist is not in difficulty. An atheist can quite rightly say, look at these texts, how do we know they're authentic? But then they have to ditch loads of texts from antiquity, because they are as ancient or more ancient than the books of the New Testament, and in addition, they have fewer copies, and they are from times much later than the events which they purport to describe. So really, the Catholic position is the most credible one, the most consistent one with those who accept the authenticity of documents from antiquity. And when it comes to dealing with Muslims, the Catholic position is far superior, because our texts are not 200 years after the event, and they therefore, given that even if you take second letter of St. Peter, you say it's 2nd century, that's still 100 years after the events of Jesus' ascension. But when you get to the Gospels, you're within decades of the events, whereas the Hadith are 200 years later. The Quran itself is a complex matter.
Well, they would say, and I'm not a Muslim, they would say, well, it was written down 200 plus years later, but we have all the generation, we know who preserved it and who decided it. Here are the names, that's why it's Muslim. That's what a Muslim would say.
Well, they can say, here are the names, but when were those names first written down? When was it first written down they were transmitting? Because until you have that, you have just stories, which may have been invented the day before they were written, or may in fact go back to Muhammad or one of his followers, but you just can't know. The only time you can start to know something is when you've got a document. So when the Muslims say, we have the chains of transmitters, well, when do we find out about who these transmitters were, that they existed? They come much later than the times of those transmitters' alleged lives anyway. So the whole Islamic project is fraught with difficulties from an historical perspective. And I know when I did a video on this months ago, and shortly after that, Sheikh Farouk Mohammed, I think his name is, or Sheikh Ibn Farouk, whatever, did a video responding to those who say the hadith are inauthentic. And he gave these chains of transmitters, referred to them, and he referred to books which give their life stories. Well, when were these life stories written? He doesn't say. Yeah, much later. And where are the chains of transmissions for those life stories? And if you've got the chain is made up of links, and the links are human beings. If the link is authentic, and each link in a hadith chain has to be authentic. If a link is authentic, you have to know about that link. Therefore, each link has to have its own authentic chain. So this is an endless problem for Islam.
You've got the names of the narrators.
Yeah. So yeah, you get a hadith saying Muhammad went to so and said X, Y, Z.
Yeah,
narrated by so and so, who got it from so and so, got it from so and so. Each of those individuals, you have to know who they are.
Okay.
Otherwise,
they don't know who they're just names on a page.
Well, that's the starting point, right? They're names on a page. So how do we know they existed? Well, that's where the Sheikh came up with his books, which give you biographies of these individuals. But these biographies aren't written shortly after these men. They're written ages later. So you need a chain of transmission from those biographies back to the original individual. But then you need a chain of transmission for each link in that chain of biography.
Yeah. It seems you're applying higher standards to the Muslims than they would apply to their own texts.
Only because modern historiography requires you do this. You can't just say, so-and-so said X, Y, Z, therefore we just accept it. Or, well, actually, the Prophet said X, Y, Z, but we know it's true because he got it from so-and-so, he got it from so-and-so, he got it from so-and-so, da-da-da. You can't just accept that face value.
Superior and that it was written shortly after the events that it reports to.
I cannot say this about the Old Testament.
You can say about the Gospels.
I can say it about the New Testament in the majority of books. Well, in the most important books, the Gospels, and particularly the first three. Then one can say it in terms of the letters of Paul. Even those are about half a dozen are accepted generally as being by him. I accept them all, but generally by scholarship. Therefore, there's a man who was a contemporary of Jesus, never met him in this life, was a contemporary of his, who wrote about him, who said in an accepted letter back to the Galatians that he went to Jerusalem and spoke to James, Peter and John, who were, he calls the pillars, because they were the closest to Jesus. So he's got access to authentic information about them on a purely human level. So this is actually not a 200 years later written down statement. This is a text from the time of those who were close to Jesus. No chain of transmitters.
So it's a bit funny when Muslims sort of talk about hadiths, quote-unquote science, as some sort of esoteric.
Because for them, it gives it the credibility of Western science, Western hard science. In fact, I'd venture to say it's like evolutionary science. It seeks to give it the credibility, evolution theory is the credibility of physics and chemistry. It doesn't deserve that at all. And in my subject, politics, they love to call that social science. Baloney. And hadith science is the same old trick. It's even worse so, because it comes from a pre-scientific age. With social science, you get an attempt to apply a certain scientific methodology in statistical analysis, for example. But in the pre-scientific Arab world, no way was anything like that available or thought of.